Greetings and welcome to Word Magazine. This is Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. And in today's episode of Word Magazine, I have a guest with me, Joseph Weissman, who is from Berit Press. Berit, Hebrew word for covenant, Berit Press. And he also is an author and writer, has a Substack that's well worth reading called The Reformed Zora. So, Joseph, welcome to Word Magazine. Good to have you as a guest today.
Thank you, Jeff. Great to be with you.
You're out in Oklahoma.
Yes, we live in Oklahoma, where I live with my wife and our three kids. They're aged 5, 3, and 1. Our littlest kept me up somewhat last night, so apologies in advance if that comes across. But
Well,
we
gi-
they're a joy. So
given you have three children that young, I'm amazed you're doing the podcast and that you have time to produce really the voluminous material you're producing on your Substack, on through Bereat Press. We're going to be talking today. Oh, by the way, I was going to say, you don't sound like you have an Oklahoma accent. It sounds like maybe more like you grew up in England. Is that right?
yeah, I grew up in England and I've been here with my wife, who is American. So we've been married for 6.5 years. But yeah, I was born in the UK, and yeah, so
Well, some of the best Americans are English people who've emigrated here. So uh, I'm glad. I'm not sure what your status is. That's not important. But anyways, good to have you not only on the podcast but in the U.S. So today we're going to be discussing a new book that has just recently come out from Bereat Press. That book is titled A Defense of the Hebrew Bible. I think there's some more to the title, like a lot of these older books are. But this book was written by a German scholar, Johann Gottlob Carpzov. Am I pronouncing the name correctly?
yep.
Who lived from 1679 to 1767. And this book was came out, the English version of it in the year 1729 originally, was translated by a fellow named Moses Marcus. And now it's being reprinted. One of the amazing things in this age, we're having this explosion of uh, the wealth of the past that is now becoming accessible to us digitally and also in, as I prefer to read, hard copy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this book. It's sort of a hot button topic because there's a lot of debate right now about the Old Testament. What's the proper text of the Old Testament? And here was one of the old Protestant divines making an argument for the use of the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. So at any rate, that's our topic today. Before we move on to sort of talking about um, Carpzov and the book, we talked a little bit about you, but Joseph, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself? And I'm interested, what are your confessional beliefs? And if you want to talk about uh, Bereat Press and how this got started, and so just tell us a little bit more about yourself and Bereat Press.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So as I said, I grew up in England. My parents each came to the church they each came out of Judaism, and they joined the church individually through the witness of a Christian friend, at least in part. And then they met when my dad was sharing the gospel with Jews in North London. And he met a lady who was my mother's grandma, and she kind of got them together, which I'm not sure how happy the rest of the family was about that. But so we were raised in going to church, and I grew up in a just non-denominational evangelical church. I believe I was a false convert most of my life, not really saved until around the age 29. I started listening to some real hard-hitting messages online about the gospel,
Mm,
as well as coming to some uncomfortable realizations about myself and my sin, and repented of my sins and accepted the free grace of Jesus Christ.
mm,
And from then on, I just grew in my faith. I began attending a kind of I call a MacArthurite church in London, and then the
mhm.
Metropolitan Tabernacle. So I'm 39 now, so yeah, nearly it's been nearly 10 years in truly in the faith, praise God. Right now, yeah, so I where I am, like confessionally, I'd say Orthodox Reformed Presbyterian. I follow the Westminster standards, and that's kind of where I am theologically. And so I've got a great interest in republishing all the material, and also just a very personal interest in the Old Testament and the validity of the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament, and of course the received text of the Greek New Testament.
Thank you for sharing. It's interesting. I did listen. You did an interview, long form interview with Nick Sayer, so I listened to a little bit of that. And you are a Jewish Christian, Jewish heritage
Mhm.
believer. And you, as you said, you have a special interest in the Old Testament, defending the traditional Hebrew text. And I learned from that also you're a bit of a linguist, and you do speak modern Hebrew. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I can.
And what
Some, somewhat.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on? I've heard other people talk about this, the difference between modern Hebrew and reading biblical Hebrew. Can the person who knows modern Hebrew pretty much easily read the Old Testament in Hebrew?
So I think often they can, but I think it's also that is partly due to the education they have of having biblical text thrust in front of them at a young age in you say in the synagogue, and also I think in school. So whether someone if you took someone who knew modern Hebrew but d didn't grow up in the Israeli or a Judaic educational system, I don't think alone from modern Hebrew they'd they know exactly how to read biblical Hebrew. I think there's a great difference. And this is actually an interesting topic because I think a lot of modern Old Testament scholarship is very Israeli led. And when it favors kind of the modernistic view, it's hard to challenge that because we might think of the Israelis as experts on Hebrew. But, the modern Hebrew, although of course it does have some roots in the biblical Hebrew, there's lots that's come in via Arabic. There are things which have come in a lot through Yiddish
Mm,
as well. And there are there's, I think, a much higher use of, I guess, the matres lectiones, the alephs and the yods and the vavs, which are helpful, which means it can be written without vowels very easily, which I think is there are some differences between that and when you need to read the biblical text. Biblical Hebrew I find much more compact
mm,
and there can be much more of a range of meaning, and that's why one reason I think those the vowel points and diacritical marks are so important. So
mm. Yeah,
typically, yes, modern Israelis understand biblical Hebrew. I don't think it necessarily follows that with the one you have the other.
right. Fascinating. Very fascinating. So with Berit Press, how many titles have you published, and are you just generally doing some of the older Reformed literature? Are you doing any contemporary works? How, tell us a little bit about that, maybe.
Yeah, so I think we've got one contemporary book just on the enforcement of the moral law by Aldo Leon, who's a PCA minister. But generally, what we have is that they're reprints, and they're mostly from the 16th and 17th century. There are some slightly more modern works. So we have Noah Webster's American Spelling Book, which we retypeset, and that's from the 19th century. But generally, the sweet spot for us is, 17th century Reformation literature. And it covers a range of topics. So things which are pretty much in accordance with Reformed Orthodoxy. Yeah. So we also came out with some educational resources. So that includes books on logic, books on rhetoric, um, a book on Latin, and then also um, I took Schaff's where he set out the Confession of Faith and a lot of historical creeds and confessions in Latin, and I put the English side by side with it, so that if you're um, learning to read Latin, it will be it's an easy way to kind of compare the two side by side. So things like that, really. And also we have quite a lot on the Masoretic text. So this Carpzov book follows a book from the Athenian Society in 1690. We also have a work which was an abstraction that was a truncation of Johannes Buxtorf's Tiberius. It's called Masora. And we also republished the Helvetic consensus formula, which is a confessional document, as I'm sure you know, which
Mm.
says that it upholds the validity and antiquity and truth of the vowel points.
Right. Wonderful. Well, so bereitpress.com for if anybody wants to go and take a look at the
So,
titles, and lots of good resources for those of us who are defending the traditional Masoretic Hebrew text of the Old Testament. So let's turn and now let's talk a little bit more about this book
mhm.
that's just come out, and let's talk about the author, Carpzov, and his defense of the Hebrew Bible. So tell us, who was Carpzov? I gave the dates of his life, but maybe you want to tell us a little bit about the context, and why he's important, and why this book, how this book fits into his ministry. I'll turn it over. Tell us about Carpzov.
So Carpzov, Johann Gottlob Carpzov was from a very well distinguished Carpzov family. And perhaps the most famous of the Carpzovs is Benedict Carpzov, who was a German legal scholar. And it is rumored that the myth that goes around is that he oversaw 20,000 executions due to witchcraft. And I don't think that
Yikes.
number's I don't think that's been corroborated, but he did more prosaically have a lot to do with what is witchcraft, what constitutes the guilt of participating in the sin of witchcraft, and he wrote copiously on that. I don't think any of his writings are in English, but he is kind of, I think maybe the or one of the founders of German jurisprudence. So I
Mm.
guess he is to the German legal system, maybe what someone like I forget the name now, but there was a uh, yeah, there are some famous
And this
English.
and this was Johann's father, Benedict, right?
I'm not exactly sure. Once, so I think this was an uncle,
Oh,
Benedict
an uncle.
Carpzov the
Okay.
younger. It may have been like a great uncle,
Okay.
but yeah. So other members of his family include Johann Benedict Carpzov. So you got Benedict Carpzov the younger, and then Johann Benedict Carpzov.
Okay.
And Johann Benedict Carpzov, I saw him variously listed as the father and also as the uncle of Johann
Huh.
Gottlob. I'm not
Yeah.
really sure, but the point here is that Johann Benedict studied under Johannes Buxtorf the Younger.
Mm.
Buxtorf the Younger was teaching at Basel, just like his father had, Johannes Buxtorf Senior. And Buxtorf Senior, Buxtorf the Elder, was considered, in the Reformation times, he was the go-to guy on Hebrew. He wrote basically Tiberius is a history of the Masoretic text, and his position totally cuts across the modern view. He said the Masoretic text was not invented by rabbis, they simply inherited a text that was already produced. And that's why
Mm.
you see so many grammatical anomalies, as it were, in the Masoretic text. If the
Mm.
Masoretes had been the authors of it, if they'd been setting down grammar rules and imposing those on the Bible, you'd expect um, consistency, but instead they merely note the inconsistencies.
Yeah.
So
It seems like in modern study, yeah, there's assumption the Buckstorffs, the elder and younger, were wrong,
Mhm.
and no, I don't, I doubt, I think probably very few people have actually read the Buckstorffs, and probably they lack the competence to be able to evaluate what they were saying, and so yeah, it'd be worthwhile to go back and read them and evaluate the arguments they were making rather than assuming that they were errant. But so we've got Carpzov. He comes from a distinguished German family. He studied at the highest levels
Mm.
with the Buxtorf the Younger in Basel, and so he's got all the credentials of his times to be one of the best Hebrew scholars, Christian Hebrew scholars.
Yeah, I think it was his Carpzov, like father or uncle who studied under the younger Buckstuff. But then Carpzov Senior taught, I suppose, would have taught Carpzov Junior, and Carpzov Junior became a distinguished scholar. He wrote the Critica Sacra. And this was, I think, part three of it, which is a
Mm,
response to William Whiston. He also wrote a commentary on Moses and Aaron, which is a book by Moses and Aaron was a book by Thomas Godwin, not Goodwin, about the difference between civil Israel and ecclesiastical Israel. And that's why he
mm.
called it Moses and Aaron. And this book was used a lot by George Gillespie to frame his arguments in Aaron's Rod's Blossoming, but it also had an impact in the rest of Europe. Also, an interesting fact about Johann Gottlob Carpzov, our author, which is relevant. He also was writing one of the early opponents of the Lutheran Pietists, which still has it's still a hot button issue today. So all that to say, this is part three of his Critica Sacra, and Moses Marcus, the translator, I think eyed this up and said, "This is what we need this in English because of some of the controversies in our day." After all, William Whiston himself was English.
Yeah, just looking at the book, as you said, it is it's a polemical work, and it's responding directly to an essay by William Whiston, with whom I'm not that familiar. So he was a professor at Cambridge in mathematics, but like in that day, many people, who maybe could be studying mathematics also had an interest in theology and scripture and so forth. But Whiston had written an essay towards restoring the true text of the Old Testament in 1772. And man, when I read that title, I was like, wow, that could be written. That sounds like a title of somebody writing today. So, I mean, it's kind of like Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun. There was this conflict going on in Carpzov's time between those who were holding to the traditional Hebrew text and those who were advocating for reconstruction of the text. No, it's corrupted and we've got to reconstruct it. So Whiston's essay towards the true text of the Old Testament. So I maybe I've already stated it, but what else would you say about Whiston and what he was proposing and why Carpzov felt compelled to want to write this book to respond to it?
Well, Jeff, I hope I won't drive you crazy just by describing what Wisdom was attempting to achieve, but brace for impact. So he wanted to take the Samaritan Pentateuch as pretty much the basis of the five books of Moses. So
Mm.
then he wanted to take
A lot of
the
Mount Gerizim in there then.
yeah, we're going back to Gerizim. So yeah, that so we're going to have a Gerizim based Pentateuch, and
Mm.
that's going to be problematic. But anyway, then we're going to bring in the Psalter from the Roman Latin Psalter because that's the best version of the Greek Old Testament, and it ought to be admired by such. Then we're going to compare our chronologies and all of this to Josephus's Antiquities, because Josephus, after all, was reading the most authentic Hebrew copies. But the present Masoretic text, don't worry, we have a use for it. It's pretty useful for restoring the original reading in several books of the Old Testament. And then we're going to take the Septuagint and we're going to use that. That will be a great help. And we're gonna throw bake into the mix is the old Syriac version, um, because that'll be of considerable assistance to our purpose, to the same purpose, and just to add some exotic flavor, we're gonna bring in the Chaldean Targums,
Mm,
because back they were written at a time when the copies weren't so bad of the
mm.
Hebrew Bible, unlike our modern corrupt ones, so to speak. And we're going to ignore all the problems with Philo the Jew of Alexandria, and we're going to bring him in to help us restore the original Septuagint readings of Moses. And we're going to use the early church writings of the apostolic constitutions and take all the citations from the Greek version from them because they were before Origin, and see what we can recover from the old Vulgate. And meanwhile, the cherry on top is we're going to, if you want to join me on an adventure, we're going to go search the world for Hebrew copies that have never come into the hands of the Masoretes and for Greek copies of the Koine, the Vulgar Septuagint version, read in the churches all the first ages of Christianity. So this is how we're going to rebuild the text according
Wow.
to which. Are you with me?
It literally sounds like a Frankentext. Yeah, we're going to take this. We're going to take the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Targumim, and we're going to amalgamate this into a much better text than the consistent Hebrew Masoretic text that was used and was the basis for all the Protestant translations and so forth. So it is amazing to think because we think that what's happening now in the academy is some development, but it's the old debate. We've been having this debate for hundreds of years, and well, it was settled for a time. There was a consensus, but now sort of the Pandora's box. When you open the box and you say the text is corrupt and we need to reconstruct it, where does it stop? I mean, this is what John Owen said. He
Yeah.
said, if we do this, if we pile up these variants and we're searching for all these ancient versions, what we end up with is not a better text. It's chaos basically in the end. Um, yeah, I wonder just a side note before we move
Yeah.
on. I want to talk about I want to ask about the translator, but I'm curious. I wonder how much of this was motivated to a certain degree by anti-Semitism, to say that the Masoretes they corrupted the scriptures. We'll talk about that later because that theory is really blossoming on the internet right now. Oh, we got to use the Septuagint because the Jews corrupted the Masoretic text. They wanted to downplay, the ministry of our Lord, etc. But just briefly, you want to respond to that, and then we'll move on to talk about Moses Marcus.
Yeah, so I think anti-Semitism is a tricky term because it can refer to so much. Some people use it to say, there was no Jewish hatred of Christ and they didn't kill him, and there's nothing in their literature which is anti-Christ and how they
Mm,
so they call that anti-Semitism to argue anything
yeah.
on that side. Moses, Marcus, and Carpzov are both saying that no, we acknowledge that there was a Jewish evil and hatred of of Christ, and they even saw a contempt towards Christians in the rabbinic writings. Buxtorf Senior had, if you ever read his Jewish synagogue, it pulls no punches
Mm,
regarding lots of Jewish rites, even circumcision and many things like that. And I think he even talks about the chicken sacrifice where they swing the chicken, and he
mm,
said that's because they read the word for a rooster, which is gever in Aramaic, and the word for man in Hebrew, gever. And they said, well, a gever for a gever, a man for a man. That's how, and basically the chicken's going to die in my place. But they
mm,
acknowledged all of these things. But at the same time, they said this does not prove that the Jews corrupted the text of Scripture.
mm,
And from that, they looked at the Jewish attitude towards the Hebrew text. It was not for them to change, although they did have many Kabbalistic superstitions about them. And that's why, in the ancient times, you're going to find copies of the Hebrew scriptures without vowel points, like they found at Qumran. Well, why? Because a lot of the rabbis are going to want to take them out so that they can play around with the meanings. And you
mm,
look at medieval Kabbalah, there was one Kabbalist, I think Abulafia, who he basically said you could do kind of magic chants by changing all the different vowel sounds of the Tetragrammaton and chanting them in different ways, and that's going to unlock the mysteries of the universe. So while they admit that that happened, the sacred Hebrew itself, they say was untouched, and they look at that through well, I mean, the most obvious reason is all the messianic prophecies about Christ are still there.
Mm,
There's nothing changed in substance that is of any benefit to rabbinic Jews
yeah,
at all. So
I don't think that the Protestant translations of the Masoretic text were hindered in any way uh, showing forth the prophecies of Christ. Yeah, yeah, and you make a valid point. Yeah, if you read the Talmud, there are a lot of very scurrilous things that are said about our Lord in that. So yeah, there were negative things that were said, but again, the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament includes all the prophecies of Christ and never hindered that forthrightly speaking about Christ. So before we move on to talk about a little
yeah,
bit more about the content, I know our time's getting away, but
so
tell me just a little bit about Moses Marcus, who translated. Carpzov wrote in Latin. Moses Marcus was in England, and he
mm.
translated it so the English-speaking audience could read this. But what do we know about him?
So it is interesting. He was a convert from Judaism, and I was just reading through some of his biography last night. He had his father was a prominent Jew from Hamburg who came to London, and I think Moses Marcus Jr., because they both had the same name. I think he went to study back in Hamburg, and he did some course, which meant he could be known as a rabbi. So he was very deep into Jewish learning, but he began to have questions and to ask questions to Christian ministers. And some of them he found satisfaction, some of their answers he was satisfied with, other answers he was not satisfied with. But basically, he gives his full testimony, and hey, maybe we'll republish that too because it looks pretty interesting.
Mm,
But yeah, he was a convert from Judaism, and he complains quite it's quite sad. He complains a lot about the persecution he had from his fellow countrymen. There were Jews who basically said, basically wished that he'd drown and
mm,
just cast scorn upon him. And he then had to kind of grapple with, well, how am I, what can I do? He was taken in, he was rescued from the ire of other of Jewish people by I think perhaps a Christian. I'm not sure. I think it would be a Christian who took him in, and he kind of talks about that. But he talks about in his translator's preface, he says he wants to clear his fellow countrymen of the charge that they'd corrupted the Masoretic text, not because he wants to cast them as saints, but he doesn't think it's true. So he acknowledges, their prejudice against
mm,
scripture, but
mm,
he's not trying to, do that for in order to give them, civil rights or supremacy or something like that.
mm,
He's simply trying to vindicate the word of God. But I think because of his personal situation, I can identify somewhat with that.
mm,
He found this a pretty useful text to retrieve
mm.
or translate.
Yeah, he has like a translator's preface that's here, and I was pretty impressed with some of the things he said. Yeah, it sounds like he had a good understanding of what the stakes were really with these issues related to the transmission of the text and the translation of it. So the book has 10 chapters, um, and they address various things, and you gave us that very helpful overview of kind of what the project was of Whiston. So let me just let's dip in at a few points, and maybe I'll just throw out a question about some various chapters, and maybe if you want to give us a little summary of what the content is to give us a little taste for it. So,
Mm.
chapter one, it seems that Carpzov is basically defending the integrity of the Hebrew text. And uh, what was going on? Who was saying it was corrupted, and on what basis was Carpzov defending the integrity of the Hebrew text?
Yeah, so he would defend the integrity from firstly Whiston's his choice of places where he could try to prove corruption. For example, Genesis 4:8, he tried to say that because it said, and Cain said to his brother, using the word, I think it's Amar, said, but there's no quoted speech that follows. Therefore, there's something missing, and other versions would then be brought in to supply the extra words. Exactly the same kind of controversy we see today. But Whiston simply points to other examples of where Amar is used, at least one other example, in Exodus 19:25. And Moses went down to the people, Vayomar Alehem, and he talked with them. It doesn't say what he said. And he said, well, there you go. He also mentions, I think, Psalm 4:4 and Psalm 139:20. And his point is, Amar doesn't necessarily need a quoted text, and he brings in some other writers. So that's one place. Another place is Exodus 12:40, where it says there was a sojourn of 430 years. And Whiston uses that to say, aha, but it was only, 210, and therefore the Hebrew is wrong. But this is actually talking about the whole time that they were in Egypt and Canaan, and that can be proven pretty easily from the original verse itself in the Hebrew. Karpzov brushes that aside. I think the big one for the modern day is, or throughout time, has been Psalm 22:16, where he talks about he claims the Jews put, instead of karu, they pierced, they put kari as a lion. Now, I've read a lot of good arguments for saying that actually we can find karu as a variant reading within the Masoretic tradition. But Karpzov doesn't take that point of view. He says, although he acknowledges it, he says, well, okay, well, let's look at this word kari, and it could be a truncated form of karim, being a noun, meaning those who pierced, the piercers, and it therefore it speaks of those who pierced my feet. And therefore, to change that noun into a verb is totally legitimate and say they pierced my hands and my feet. And he gives examples of where this can happen, and also where I think there was an extra aleph that in the word kari that's now not there. He shows how every now and then a Hebrew word can lose a letter. I think that's, if I'm summarizing it correctly, I'm kind of doing it partly from glance and partly from memory from this, but I have blogged and documented more fully Karpzov's argument here. But basically, also Deuteronomy 32:8, the children of Israel versus the angels of God. He defends the traditional reading there. The acrostic, people say, well, there's a missing nun in Psalm 145. Yeah, but if you look at he says if you look at the acrostic psalms in Psalm 25, 137, Psalm 34, there are examples of missing letters, or in Psalm 34, one verse which has two letters in it. So this is not a new thing for the Holy Spirit to choose to miss a letter in an acrostic. It doesn't have some kind of hidden meaning necessarily. But yeah, I mean, those are just that's a whistle-stop tour of chapter one.
Yeah, it all sounds fascinating. Obviously, Psalm 22:16 is, that it's often talked about. The Psalm 145, as a so-called broken acrostic that modern scholars are now in modern translations attempting to correct, and not realizing that there might have been, and there was, in fact, intentionality sometimes in having a broken acrostic to make an underlying, perhaps theological point. In the we're about to come out with a book from the Reformation Bible Society, our journal, from that'll have our papers from our 2024 conference, and we're reprinting in that Larry Brigden's article on Psalm 145, making some of those arguments, like you're saying, comparing with the fact that there are broken acrostics in other psalms, etc. So all of that sounds very helpful and useful. Um, there's a lot of talk today about the Septuagint. Let's use the Septuagint to correct the Hebrew. And there's a chapter 3, is Carpzov's discussion of the Septuagint. What did he say about the Septuagint?
So, one thing that's pretty interesting is Carpzov, he brings in some quotes from early church fathers because the kind of consensus is that the early church fathers quoted exclusively from the Septuagint. So, I'll see if I can give you one example. Okay, so if I read, and Karpov sometimes assumes a lot of familiarity with both the Septuagint and the Masoretic. So I'm just going to help out someone who doesn't have all these verses in mind. So I'm just going to give you one example, and then there'll be more in the book if your listeners choose to read it, which I do recommend. So Psalm 50 verse 21 says, "These things hast thou done, and I kept silence. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such a one as thyself, but I will reprove thee and set them in order before thine eyes." That's in the Masoretic. And in the Septuagint, it says, "These things thou didst, and I kept silent. Thou thoughtest wickedly that I should be like thee, but I will reprove thee and set thine offenses before thee." And then where we have Justin Martyr quoting from it, he renders it um, like like this: "I will reprove thee and set thy sins before thy face." Which, okay, before thee, is that like the Septuagint, or is it like before my eyes, like the Masoretic? Is it
Mm,
his own rendering? And then he quotes Clement, the church father, who renders the same verse, "I will set thee before thy face." And then if you look at verse 22 in the Masoretic, it says, "Now consider ye this, ye that forget God, lest I tear you in pieces, and there be none to deliver." And in the Septuagint, it's, "Now consider these things, ye that forget God, lest he rend you, and there is no deliverer." So it's the idea of tearing in pieces. Well, Ignatius has it, "Lest he tear, and there be no deliverer." And Clement has it, "Lest he tear as a lion." And so basically, you can see um, Psalm 19, verse 3, "There are neither speech nor languages," is how Justin Martyr renders it. Clement has it the other way around, and "there are neither languages nor speeches." So there's a big fallacy committed where we read the way that a church father renders the Bible in Greek and say that is necessarily the Septuagint, because sometimes it's different from our modern versions, and sometimes there's variants with other church fathers and variants from one father to other places of his own writing. And that's basically the argument that he makes is he says Justin's not constant to himself. He reads Psalm 72:3 differently. At one place it says, "Analabeto taori eninin to lao," and another place, "Analabetas tosan taori to lao erinin," and let the mountains bring peace to the people. So he's saying Weston can't prove anything from the citations of the church fathers about the Septuagint, and I agree, and I think just going to throw another one in there, which is not, I don't think this is in the book, but I think Psalm 95 or Psalm 96 from the Word. When you look into that, it's not as clear cut as a lot of people make it out to be as well, because the same words are missing in the Septuagint. So when Justin Martyr talks about corruption, does he really mean the Jewish corruption of the Hebrew? Does he mean corruption of the Greek? So there are all these things which are thrown open. But yeah, I find it really fascinating the way Karpzov deals with the Septuagint and the Church Fathers in a way we don't really hear these days.
interesting. Well, I mean, it just having read a lot of the contemporary scholars about the Septuagint, I think one of the things that's coming out more and more is even the modern scholars, mainstream academic scholars, are acknowledging what's called the problematization of the word Septuagint. And many of them are saying we need to stop saying the New Testament quotes the Septuagint. And they're acknowledging that there were many Greek translations of the Old Testament. There wasn't a uniform Septuagint
Mm.
until the Christian era. I mean, even the Ralph's Handhart edition of the Septuagint is based on Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. They're all coming from the fourth and fifth centuries. So they're really coming from the Christian era. So there wasn't a uniform Septuagint. And sometimes it's the author making his own translation. Who knows what sometimes the church fathers are drawing on. So there is no uniform Septuagint. And we'll have somebody glibly come along and say, well, Paul quoted the Septuagint here. What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to take Romans 4:13, where Paul says, "And Abraham became the heir of the world," where clearly in every Septuagint, Samaritan, Masoretic, it's all saying he became the heir of Canaan. Are we now going to say Paul was quoting the Old Testament and it said the world all along, and therefore we need to go through the world until we find a manuscript in which the Old Testament says, Abraham became the heir of the world? Or can we recognize that the New Testament does something different than
Yeah.
with the Old Testament? And that's I think the strongest part of the Carpzov book, where he gives all the different uses the New Testament has of the Old Testament. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it's a must read for people who are interested in this topic. Looking forward to reading it more closely myself. One of the odd things I noticed that we haven't talked about yet is in chapter four, uh, Carpzov was responding to uh, uh, a challenge to the canonicity of the Song of Songs. Is that right?
Yep. Yep.
So it's not
The
just text,
argument,
but whole books were being challenged. So Whiston was saying, "Song of Songs, that shouldn't be in the canon." Was that basically what he was saying?
yeah, yeah, it was too vulgar, and Solomon was clearly unrepentant when he wrote it, is the idea.
Oh,
So he can
well,
Solomon can sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I say we laugh at that, but you know, um, there have been modern figures who are saying, let's just get rid of second and third John, or even
Mm.
when you jettison the ending traditional ending of Mark, you're essentially jettisoning 12 verses, which some books are that long. But anyways, it's kind of interesting that there was a challenge to the Song of Songs. The argument is it's too erotic. The content is too salacious. You said that Solomon was unconverted when he wrote it. That's actually what the argument that was being made at the time.
That's part of it, but basically Karpov says, if you got a dirty mind, that's how you're going to read it, pretty much. But it
Oh,
wasn't just that. He's also, for example, his evidence is he compares his bride to horses, I think, and therefore and therefore Whiston says, well, you see, Solomon was a king who multiplied horses to himself, and the Torah says, you shall not multiply, wives and horses to yourself. Well, therefore he multiplied horses to himself, so he was greedy for horses. Therefore he was unregenerate when he wrote it. And Karpzov says, well, maybe he just had a few horses. So it doesn't have to be, And then another one is where he says, Song of Solomon 6 and 8, 6 verse 8, where it talks about many queens and concubines. And then verse 9 says, but, my love is the only one. And
yeah.
so basically, Wisdom reads it and says, you see, he's got lots of wives and concubines now. And Karpzov reads it and says, no, he's saying among all the queens and concubines that there are, my love is the only one, just as, there are many individual churches, but yet the church considered as the bride of Christ is one. So yeah, it's he doesn't need to spend too long on this, but it is fascinating to see.
Yeah.
He was looking for a textual reconstruction, didn't stop at changing some
Mm,
verses, or it ended up eating away at the whole Bible itself, the whole books.
mm. You already touched upon a little bit. The Samaritan Pentateuch is discussed in chapter six, and there might be somebody listening, that there were Samaritans who had an alternate edition of the Pentateuch over against the Jewish Pentateuch, and I mentioned they wrote in things like Mount Gerizim as central place, but that's discussed, and he's refuting the authority of the Samaritan Pentateuch over against the Hebrew Masoretic text. You mentioned also briefly chapter 8 discusses the writings of Josephus, and you said the issue there was um, that Whiston was saying, let's follow the chronology of Josephus rather than the chronology of the Old Testament. Anything you want to add on either
Mm.
one of those before we move on?
Yeah, so basically, Carpzov basically proves that Josephus was pretty bad at Hebrew and mistranslates words, and says that that's one argument. Another thing he points out about Josephus is where Josephus, he says he perverts the sense of Moses when to the laws promulgated by Moses, he adds these: let nobody blaspheme the gods, which other cities esteem to be such, rifle not the sacred things of strangers, and take not away a gift dedicated to any god. Now, that can't be found, obviously, in any Bible, but
Hmm.
think about Josephus. He was a Jew who escaped Jerusalem trying to save his skin and please his masters. And so he's adding things either out of Jewish tradition or he says, or out of his own imagination. And I think possibly due to a desire to please the Romans. But yeah, I think that yeah, he claims that yeah, he basically I won't go through it all, but basically Josephus makes a lot of spurious claims, and Karpzov quotes a lot of Reformed Orthodox and Lutherans who said that we don't just take Josephus's word for everything, and here are some good reasons why. So he gives a pretty nuanced view that basically Josephus's account of the Jewish wars is pretty good, but when you look at his antiquities, there's a lot of corruption because even Josephus himself said that he was taking things out of many books. So again, just like we said about Justin Martyr, there are contradictions within Josephus's own chronology, where he gives one amount of time for one event, and then he gives a different amount of time for the same event in a different place of his writing. So in other words, he's not. You can read Josephus's works, and if you put it all together, you'll see, well, I he's not reliable within himself, so therefore, why are we gonna trust him? Which I thought was pretty good.
And I know we're sort of skimming the surface, but
Mhm.
hopefully this is giving a helpful overview to some of the content. Chapter 9 of the 10 chapters, the little description of the pretended corruptions designedly brought into the Hebrew and Greek copies by the Jews against Proposition 12. So in chapter 9, he's directly discussing the theory that Jews had corrupted the copies, both Hebrew and Greek copies, to work against Christianity. I know we talked about that briefly already. Anything else you want to add on that? What Karpzov, the arguments he's making?
Yeah, he claims basically they changed it so the prophecies would line up to Bar Kokhba, who was led a Jewish revolt around I think around 100 years after Christ began his ministry. But I mean, he basically says that this doesn't make sense, and pretty much all the prophecies still apply. And so he says that he basically says that there's no evidence we have that this even favors that the Masoretic text even favors a prophecy of Bar Kokhba over Christ. One place I can think of is I can't recall if he mentions this in this context, but Daniel 9:24 to 27, the math adds up to Christ, not to someone a century later.
Mm.
So yeah, he basically says we have no evidence that the they changed the letters or anything. And yeah, he will go through that and basically say that there's just not really any evidence, and because he quotes from their own Talmud that they can't change the letters, which is a pretty useful quote. Um, and yeah, that's what I'd say for that one.
Yeah. Well, again, it's a defense. I would say overall, it seems it's just as I mean, the title of it is a defense of the Hebrew Bible, and it's really a defense of the the classic Protestant Orthodox defense. I mean, reflected in our confessions of faith, Westminster Confession of Faith, Second London Baptist Confession of Faith 1:8, that the Bible was immediately inspired in Hebrew and in Greek, Hebrew for the Old Testament and in Greek for the New Testament. I recently did a podcast and someone was saying, "How do you know it's the Masoretic text?" Well, I mean that's what they had. That's what the Protestant translations were based upon. That's what the scholarship was based upon. And then uh, you had the inroads pretty quickly already in the early 18th century, and Carpzov is in the 18th century, and you really have the seeds of what will be modern historical criticism that's developing, and that'll come to full flower in the 19th century. And really, though, with the respect to the Old Testament, we're really seeing it now in the 20th century and now the 21st century, where it's the Old Testament that is, they're saying we need to change based on Dead Sea Scrolls, Samaritan Pentateuch,
Yeah.
Septuagint, Syriac, etc. And so it's a very relevant issue, contemporary issue for today. Well, I know we've only scratched the surface, and folk
Yeah.
will have to get the book, read it for themselves. So we probably ought to bring things to a conclusion. Is there anything, Joseph, you want to add before we leave?
Yeah, if readers are interested, firstly, we have a free version of Buxtor's book on the Masorah on berrypress.com. You can just read it. It's a short truncation of his work. Um, Also, if you are interested in my Substack Reform Masorah, I have lots of articles on different verses that are challenged. For example, I read and heard recently that we don't know what the Hebrew was of Genesis 37:3, where it said Joseph wore a coat of many colors. So I went back into the old scholarship and proved that we can know that pasim means colors, and I looked through different uh, grammars and commentaries. So I did an article about how the Dead Sea Scrolls do not disprove the antiquity of the Hebrew vowel points. This kind of argument was around in the 18th century, and Bernardinus de Moor took it on. I've got lots of articles on various parts of the Apocrypha. I've got an article showing that the 70 in Exodus is counted differently to the 75 in Acts and how that's completely
Mm,
consistent. Also, I think the article I most want readers to look at is I have one about the Masoretic text vindicated in Isaiah 61 verses 1 through 2. It's a complex one, but Christ was not reading from the Septuagint. He was reading from the Masoretic Hebrew, and I proved that, I believe, convincingly. It's just the Hebrew is more compact than the Greek, so the Greek takes some extra words, as actually Carpzov mentioned. Carpzov takes a slightly different position to me. I believe all that you find within Carpzov claims the Holy Spirit gave some extra words to explain the Hebrew and the Greek. I think pretty much the same, except everything we read in the Greek you can find in the words of the Hebrew. There's a word pekach koach to talk about the opening of the prisoners, but the word used for opening doesn't mean to open the doors of prison. It means to open someone's sight or hearing. So the verb used for the opening of the prison, which you'd expect to be a different one, is instead a verb which means to open the senses. So it says he's going to open the senses of the prisoners, and that word pakach is then strengthened by the word koach. So it's le pakach koach, which indicates a double opening. So it's the opening of the prisoners, but it's also the opening of their eyesight, because that's how the verb is used throughout. So therefore, that's why Christ says the opening of the prisoners and the opening
mm.
of the sight to the blind. That's where it comes from. It comes from the Hebrew. So that's where people. That's what trips most people up. So check out the Substack if you're interested.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very relevant. As somebody was asking me or challenging online just this week about that Luke 4 and what Bible was Christ reading from and so forth. So that sounds very, very interesting, and we can certainly direct people to your Substack to read some reasonable. I mean, sometimes people think you can't make a reasonable argument in defense of the traditional text. Certainly, you can. Um, well, I guess we're going to bring things to a close. Thank you so much for being my guest today. I hope that our listeners have found this conversation helpful and edifying and encouraging. And so we hope that you'll check out Bereat Press, check out the Joseph's Substack, and read the Reformed Misora. And anyways, hopefully we'll have some future conversations on issues related to the defense of the traditional text, and defense of the Hebrew Bible, the defense of the received text of the Greek New Testament. Again, look forward to speaking to you in the next episode of Word Magazine. Till then, take care and may the Lord richly bless you.